Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and I'm absolutely thrilled today to have with us Dr. Adolfo Mora from Schreiner University, Associate Professor of Communication. Dr. Mora, thank you and welcome to the podcast.
I am very thrilled. Hello, everyone.
You are Professor of Communications. This is your academic field of study. So I was wondering if you could maybe detail for our audience your academic background.
Yes. So then I've always been fascinated with media. In high school, I used to get my parents' video recorder and I would just do funny videos. And this was in 2005, and we were recording into cassette tapes. So then that started the whole idea of, wow, this is thrilling. Let me just see what I can do this as a potential career. And this was in Laredo, Texas. So then we did have a local university, and there wasn't anything like TV production at that time in 2005. And the best choice for me was communication at the time. So then that's when I got introduced to communication generally. And that's how I understood that media is a type of communication. So then after that, I worked with the local news station for about a year after I graduated in 2009. And then in 2010, I went for a master's in communication, still fascinated with media. And then slowly I jumped from communication as a study to media studies for the PhD. And then I went to UT Austin. I did study more about media theory, media studies, not necessarily producing, but more about from the audience perspective, how do you understand media?
And so, do you have a master's and PhD?
I do.
And could you tell us the subject matter of your PhD dissertation?
My dissertation looked at color blindness because we are in a time where most people are saying we are over race. We are not looking at race anymore when it comes to me creating a relationship with you. I see you as a person. So then that is what we call color blindness. And I really wanted to understand that relationship between that belief and how people saw ethnic representations on TV. So then I really looked at that relationship, and it turns out that more you believe in color blindness, then the less that you saw some characters' ethnic identity. So then it was a really interesting relationship.
And could you tell us about your professional career after you received your PhD?
After I received my PhD, I wanted to work in academia. So then I applied to places. And when I applied to Schreiner, it did really feel like home. The way that they told me about what Schreiner is and what sort of culture they have. And it meshed really well with my own teaching philosophy, which is teaching in a more practical way, being very open to how I want to teach the class instead of the university telling me, here's how you should teach the classes. They're pretty open to allowing me as a professional to say, here's what the classes should look like. And it's up to me to create the type of classes that I can bring to. So then in the classes, I make them as practical as they can be. We still have theoretical discussions of media and communication because it's not just a media program, it's a communication program. So then I do teach media classes and communication classes.
The obviously the size of Schreiner is very different than UT Austin.
Mhm.
How do you find the size, the physical size of the student body at Schreiner as a plus?
I found an easy transition to come from UT Austin and being in larger classes or teaching larger classes to now teaching more personal, smaller classes. I believe the ratio at Schreiner now is about 15 to one faculty member. So then it is pretty personal. What I remember when I was getting my PhD in UT Austin, we used to have discussion sections. So then, yes, we had a class of 300 people, but then all the students will break into discussion sections. So that way they could ask the teaching assistant, hey, I didn't quite understand this concept. Instead of interrupting the instructor, then they would have us in more smaller groups, like up to 15 individuals, and we would do 3 discussion sections a week. So then that's where I got my training in really being more personal with students during those discussion sessions.
It's interesting you say that because I also attended UT Austin in the 70s. And
Mm,
my experience, I'm a history undergraduate degree in history. And my experience was we might be in larger classes, certainly as a freshman or sophomore. Once you move to the classes directly in your major, the size shrunk considerably, but even then, the size would shrink with discussion groups. So it was a very, and the teaching assistants, frankly, I found just wonderful because they were so passionate about the subject matter. They were learning how to teach in many ways, but they were historians. They just wanted to talk history. And so that's what it became. And so I had an intimate feeling, although I was going to attending a university of nearly 50,000 people.
Wow. So then let me ask you a question then. So then what is a discussion point during your time at UT in the 70s that you remember now that still haunts you, that still it's in your mind?
Sure, a couple. I learned about the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania in a way I hadn't before. And I had Civil War. I took a Civil War class from an incredibly distinguished professor who was his last year to teach, but his teaching assistant was great, and the subject matter or our text was a trilogy by Shelby Foote that we were required to read, and our discussions were just following Shelby Foote, and he is one of America's greatest men of letters, focused on the South and the Civil War. So his writing was fabulous, his history was fabulous, and I learned much more of the Civil War than I ever had before from him. And I guess the other thing was I learned it was when I was in high school, I grew up in a household where you'd ask a question and get an answer,
Mhm.
no discussion. And I learned in college that you could go off just on tangents for hours
Yeah.
and it didn't matter. And it was a wonderful way to learn new ideas, new things, new experiences, and just to get to practice a love of history literally at an individual or group level that I'd never experienced before.
Thank you for sharing because what you just said, it correlates very much with what I do at Schreiner, which is that discussion part, which is a back and forth. So then at UT, I did teach straight lectures, which is okay, you have 90 minutes. Here's all the information, very little discussion because it was more about here's the concept, you need to get it, practice it, period, move on. So then now at Schreiner, I do have a lot of discussions and we go in on multiple tangents many times. But my role as an instructor is to still say, yes, we can have a nice discussion. Let's try to understand how complex it is. But remember that we're still talking about this from a very specific perspective. And I do enjoy that. And my hope is to inspire the students just like how you were inspired for them to go back and be like, wow, I can retain the information through a conversation as opposed to was it letter A or B or C or D from the exam.
Let me go into some detail in some areas that you've raised that have intrigued me. And I want to start with the cassette tape as a storyline and your use of the cassette tape to record. And why that struck me so much was in the 60s, I had a reel to reel recorder,
Yeah.
very big, very heavy, very cumbersome. And my parents would not let me bring it out into the living room to put in front of the television to record, but they would let me put a cassette recorder. And literally, I would hang mics down in front of the speaker to record television shows. And obviously, that part of your remark struck me, but it also struck me that you might be in a sort of a generational bridge of people who knew what a cassette was and you actually used a cassette as opposed to maybe some of your students who may not have ever seen a cassette, who may not have ever listened to a cassette, and they may not have ever used it for a recording, but they know how to record with a smartphone or other device. And so I was wondering if you might talk about the students you have now, the generation that's at Schreiner University, and how do they see recording and the recording medium, perhaps or in contrast to your experience?
So then I'm a millennial, generation Y. So then I or my generation has been documented to be in the middle of the digital and the physical media generation. So then starting with Generation Z, they are still getting some exposure to physical media. But now we go into Generation Alpha, which is the middle schoolers now and even the elementary school students. Today, for sure, by the time that they come and take a media and communication class, they will be like, what's a cassette tape? So then I still haven't run into that, but I do know that it's an important part of media history. So then in my mass communication class, I make it a point to bring in the old TV sets. I make it a point into having students insert the VHS tape into the media, into the VCR and things like that, because I tell them, you know what, at some point in time, this was everyday life for people. In regards to media, we created a relationship with tangible things. So then there was something about standing up and changing the channel that irritated a lot of people, but it was part of everyday life. There was even some research done about the power of the control remote, how like whoever held the remote controlled the media experience. So then, and that is quite interesting to talk about the relationship between media and society. And now most people believe that media has become individualized, like it's not longer that much of collective experience. Of course, there is collective experiences within media, but it turns out that most media habits are now more individual. But at least for me, as this generation Y, it is very important for me to still share my own upbringing, my own beliefs, the way that it was back in the day. So that way they could draw a better relationship to maybe this is why we do things now, right? Because that's the interesting thing about history, that we can go back and then we can learn from the past. So then in mass communication, for sure, I bring tangible media.
I was at a swap meet in December and somebody had 100 cassettes in a box
Hmm.
and they said it was $3 a cassette.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about it and thinking about it. And he looked at me and said, I'm sick of looking at them. 20 bucks and they're yours. I bought them, the whole box. And I don't have a cassette player, but I couldn't pass up 20 or 100 cassettes.
So nostalgia is nostalgia.
The physical or the medium of record. Now let's explore this further. Now I'm really intrigued. So obviously I grew up with albums or
Hmm.
LPs, if you want to go down that path. And we used to feel like we got to know a group, a band, a singer, a musician on an album.
Hmm.
Certainly singles existed and those were the charts and what everyone paid a lot of attention to, and they could be a lot of fun. But you really felt like you got to know an artist on an album because albums would have sometimes sort of non-commercial yet very personal songs. Some groups might play a completely different style, go from rap to jazz to disco to rock and roll, and give you a real insight. And I felt like I lost that in the digital era, even though, of course, I can download an album. But a couple of years ago, I my wife gave me a turntable, so I've been repurchasing every album I ever had. And so I'm enjoying the album experience with the one completely irritating point of every 20 minutes I have to stand up and turn the album over. Could you say a few words about your experience, or did you have a similar experience, or is the digital experience completely different than the music listening experience someone like myself had perhaps growing up in the age of albums?
So then we're talking about media taste at some point. And for me, bringing in physical media, I can share with the students. Again, we can talk about the relationship that we develop with physical media. Obviously, in this case of the cassette or the LP, you had to get up to change the song and things like that. And for you to save some energy, it was better to let the the LP play entirely, so that way you can just sit down. But now this is what I was talking about, that things have become more individualized, right? You're not listening to the 13 songs, you're only listening to that one song. So then when it comes down to the media industry, then we can just go and talk about the whole media environment in order for us to kind of explain one behavior. So then it's a very complicated thing for sure. And for me, that's what I was talking about, that it's not until you go through someone else's experience that you begin to understand where it started and why it is here now. So then it's like looking through someone's perspective through their shoes. And that's what I try to create. So then if you ask about my own personal experience, for sure, I'm part of that generation that still had to get up, that still had to buy things on a VHS. And then whenever the VHS tape will be all crumbly and the image would be bad, then I had to buy a new one. But then I didn't have $20. And now that they're 50 cents for sure, I will buy it just to relive an experience.
The let me turn to I'm not sure how if I'm gonna ask this correctly, but with tools that are available, either digital media or a smartphone or other tools, the barrier to entry as a musician, as a podcaster, as someone who wants to use some digital format, either for communication or for our business, is much less.
Mhm.
And in many ways, I tell people it's only a smartphone.
Yeah.
Do students today in 2025 see the opportunity in front of them, perhaps you and I didn't have, but we've now fully embraced in the digital media?
I think that most people are aware about the power of the smartphone in relationship to media inclusion because now, sure, you can do a podcast. Now you can do a YouTube channel. Now you can create a film through your smartphone. So then that belief is very much ingrained in people know about it. And if we understand media environments, and this is where media studies can become a great tool for us to really understand the complexity of something, then we can go into the digital divide. And then what the digital divide tells us about the success of newer generations in handling those devices. That's a whole separate conversation. One conversation is access. Sure, you have a smartphone, you can create. The second conversation piece that is correlated to this is can they do it? And that's where you're going to get a lot more diversity in terms of the experience that not everybody really knows how to use these devices. I cannot tell you that even me teaching a foundation public speaking class that I asked the students create a PowerPoint and most of them do know how to do it. Kinda. And then some others are still like, "I don't know how to turn it in." So then you still see like now, yes, there is this belief that sure, just because of the smartphone, we can have access and we can be included. But then the second conversational piece is, can you do it well? And then you go into a larger conversation, not only coming now from the digital divide, now from the media industry perspective, which is now because everybody has a podcast, then you have competition. The competition has quadrupled because now people have tons of choices. It's not just the three choices that was maybe hypothetically speaking 15 years ago. Now it is infinite, right? Because we don't even know how many podcasts there are, or how many YouTube channels there are, or how many TV shows there are because there's so many. So then I hope that you can kind of see how interesting media studies is because it allows us to look at a conversation from very different perspectives. And then it all of a sudden makes things more complicated. And complicated is good. It is definitely head scratching, but it is good because then it allows us to really understand how exactly are we entering the conversation and what contribution can we have in the conversation.
You mentioned the term digital divide. You talked about it, I believe, in the context of generations. I
Mhm.
wanted to ask you, is there a digital divide in other areas such as socioeconomic, such as racial or ethnic, economic, maybe even geographic? We're here in the hill country of West Texas, and perhaps a little differently than a large city such as San Antonio, Austin, Houston, Dallas. Are there multiple digital divides from the academic perspective?
Oh, for sure. So then once you go into the literature, you will see that geography is a factor. Your demographic factors like ethnicity, race, gender, socioeconomic status also impact the digital experience that you have. And it happened that my advisor for the PhD was one of the people that did a lot of studies on the digital divide. Shout out to Joseph Strohar. Thank you so much for your knowledge that you pass on to me. So then we were looking into that, like in Austin, Texas, being such a hip city, such a city with many different sectors from economy to entertainment. And this was a hub for my professor to do research about the digital divide because there were some spots, geographic areas within the city that were not really thriving within this economic artistic boom. So then that's where the whole idea of the digital divide now started to be theorized. That we have such a thing called techno capital. What how much you know about technology can eventually grant you upward mobility. But it's not just techno capital acting by itself, it's its relationship to economic capital to cultural capital to social capital, and how all of these things are interrelated into one another. So then, if you really want to start understanding this idea of who has access and how much access, then yes, you have to look at the entire picture. So then, like I said, these conversations can very well go into an hour or two of conversation. So then, even in the classes that I teach, I tell students we can only dabble very little into it because my responsibility now is to introduce you the theory, to tell you what some of the trends are. But for us to find the solution, we can't, or at least not now. We will need more time to really fully explore the topic.
So the questions I've asked you in our conversations so far, I would say have tended to be more in the creator economy,
Mhm.
where an individual might want to put their music out, put their
Yeah.
animation out, put their podcast out. But do students also see this digital communication strategy as a part of something that can be used in a business in context beyond simply a creator as an overall communications tool?
They're very aware. I think that I just got visited by marketing business students because they wanted to help the AV club have more success as a student organization. And one of their immediate suggestions for me was social media presence. So then you can kind of see that for sure, newer generations prioritize digital strategies to ensure that you have a digital footprint in order for people to see you. Then I am pretty sure that newer generations know the impact of their own digital media environment.
Could we move towards the end of our podcast, going back to some of the things you are teaching and what you might hope to teach at Schreiner, perhaps in the fall semester or maybe
Mhm.
even in the next year?
For sure. So then in the fall of 2025, upper division communication classes that I will be teaching mass communication. So then this is the class that I pretty much briefly spoke about right now about what I do. So then in that class, every 2 weeks, we go through a different sector of mass communication. We do a little bit of radio, we do a little bit of magazines, a little bit of books, a little bit of TV. So then it's just mostly a class about media history for the students. So then what I do in that class is now I want to be more intentional with my students and I want to make sure that they themselves bring in conversation starters too into the class. And basically, I'm going to ask them to bring in their own VHS tapes, their own magazines, even if it's not their own, that probably their parents. So that way we can kind of see from their perspective also what sort of media experience they have. So then that will be the most media oriented communication class that I have. And I will be teaching communication theory. So then that one is more general. So then we do talk about how do relationships start? How do relationships get maintained? Let's look at mass communication as a consumer oriented perspective where people create, people consume. So then what is it that we can theorize about it? So then you can kind of see that the focus is very different. It's not so much experiential, but it is more technical where they really need to understand the predictions that media theory can or communication theory can make.
Dr. Moore, unfortunately, we are now at the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if anyone wanted to find out more information on your role at Schreiner or perhaps the courses you teach, what might be the best place for them to go?
For sure, email. I think email for me, I do check it at least 3 times a day. So then I try to do my best to answer everyone. If I don't answer within 2 days, then that is basically a memo for you to resend the email just because I have so many students that I go through and other instructors also need something from me or we're doing something, but my email would be amora@schreiner.edu. So then I welcome everyone, seriously. Even if you have a story to share, then come on over. I think that we're always looking for someone's story and what we can learn from that story.
Dr. Moore, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with us. This has been a fascinating exploration.
Thank you so much to everyone.